My name is John Malcolmus. I'm the creative director at Oculus. I'd like to introduce two colleagues of mine who have been working in VR pretty extensively every single day for the last couple of years and have discovered quite of interesting things, specifically around user interfaces, product design, and building great experiences that people will enjoy using on a daily basis and coming back to. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brady, lead product designer, and Richard Emms, lead coder.
Okay, first, because we got an awesome full house, I want you all to wave at me while I take your picture. And please wave now. Thank you. Thanks for all showing up. I really appreciate it. So, where's my clicker? Here we go. We're going to talk about designing UI, user interfaces, and user experiences in VR. I want to give a little bit of context as to who we are, where we were before coming to Oculus, and kind of things that led us to being designers at Oculus. I'm Kristoffer Brady. I'm the lead product designer. And I've been working as a designer, art director, animator, kind of multidisciplinary guy for well over a decade. A lot of different types of projects, some of which you can see here. Some are personal, some are for clients. And when I'm not doing product design at Oculus, and before I was at Oculus, I spent a lot of time designing, animating, making various stuff. And one of those passions is this thing right here. And it's this type of work that, for me, leans into creating UIs for VR. And it's one of the main reasons why I was so excited about VR as a medium, because I wanted to express this kind of stuff in VR. And I wanted to take this vision of UI and smash it into VR and see what happens.
Hi, everyone. I'm Richard Emms. I'm a designer and coder at Oculus. I create VR prototypes that help prove out concepts at Oculus. So when we're looking at future designs, that's what I'm working on. I visualize VR environments, I visualize interfaces and interaction schemes. And I love to explore that stuff. That's really what gets me going. So all kinds of interaction and motion in virtual reality is what I do. I'm passionate about interaction design, and I've been doing work in independent games for many years. One thing that I worked on was Outer Wilds. This is a space exploration game that takes place in the solar system stuck in a time loop. It won IGF 2015 Grand Prize, Excellence in Design. And another thing up there that you might see and recognize is Spacewalk. This is a very quick, small project that I worked on. Super early DK1 experience that just put players into astronaut suits and had them discover the ISS together. Creating Spacewalk was really what got me excited about the potential of virtual reality. In my spare time, I'm working on a game called Apartment: A Separated Place, which we successfully crowdfunded through Kickstarter. In this game, you play as a guy who just got dumped by his girlfriend, and you get to experience his path to resolution and reclaiming his space. The game uses player interactions and interactivity and mechanics to tell its story in a similar way that I'm interested in exploring interactivity in virtual reality.
Thanks, man. So what do we do? What does it mean to be a product designer at Oculus? And we're going to talk mostly in the context of creating consumer products and how that sort of translates into VR and some of the lessons that we've learned doing so. At Oculus, we were mostly designing, prototyping, and building stuff for people to use, right? And although we do see things through to completion, working really closely with our engineers, most of our time is spent in the design and prototyping phases. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, but what's nice about these two phases is that they inform and complement one another. It's a relationship between the two. It's not really one before the other. So I'll get back to that a little bit in a little bit. So every UI needs a form of input, right? And we have, as a challenge, to design for quite a number of different types when solving for this widest audience possible. Obviously, touch is super exciting to work with, but not everyone's going to have it right away. A game controller is a bit more standard. It's got feature sets and button configurations that you guys map to, but not everyone's going to have access to that either. So really, for us, the lowest common denominator is raycasting or gaze plus touch. And it's really a unique challenge when designing UIs. And it's an important thing to consider when you're trying to create something for everybody to use. So coming back to this slide, a big part of our process is being in these two phases, right? So when we first have an idea, we generally do like a loose visual pass, a loose UX pass. But alongside that, we're simultaneously building a prototype of that same idea, which lets us play with interactions right away and expose holes in the design that weren't obvious in static form. And then vice versa, you can't really have a good functioning prototype without a nice thought out design ahead of time. So there's a relationship between the two, and they're really important to maintain that sort of elevated, they need to elevate at the same time, basically. They need to come up through the process at the same time, not one before the other. So one thing we do is we use Unity quite a lot to test and prototype our ideas. This is a shot from one of our older scenes, but what this really illustrates and what it's meant to show is just like a simple tool that allows our 2D designers to quickly drop comps into Unity and view them in VR. We can then tie simple interactions to them and test their ideas quickly without wasting any time building out complex things that might not actually work or be the best solution for what we're trying to achieve. We also use Cinema 4D a lot, MoGraph, all the things that Cinema 4D offers that lets us create kind of quick proof of concepts, rough out ideas, and kind of have fun and explore things that might not end up being viable products. The Cinema 4D to Unity pipeline also makes our life pretty easy, and it's been pretty efficient and simple to manage. So to give a little bit of context, the main project that myself and Richard work on is Oculus Home. This is a screen of a work in progress, something that most people have not seen. But it gives you an idea of where we're headed in comparison to what exists out there today. And the really reason that I wanted to show this right now is because I wanted to tell you a little bit about our iterative process. And so looking at this, this is a piece from our library of an older version of Home. And a lot of our work comes from this sort of constant iteration or this constant iterative process. And I'm sure if you've heard anybody talk about product design, that comes up a lot. And that feedback loop informs our work, comes from many different sources, such as user research, and of course, our community, you guys, which we're very thankful that you're very vocal about feature sets and improvements that you would like to be or like to see made. So thank you for that. And so showing these iterations is sort of just to give you an idea of where we were and where we're headed and part of that process and how that changes over time. So looking at this, it's just like a shot from the library of one of the earliest versions of Home. And overall, this was great for launch. It worked with the amount of content that we had at that time, but it didn't really scale that well. And you can only look at one or two pieces of content at the same time. So once content started rolling in and we had a lot more to offer, the next version of the library solved that issue with a larger number of tiles visible. And along with like a vertical scrolling mechanism, we felt it made it a lot faster to move through the growing amount of content in a more efficient and dynamic manner. Excuse me. So moving into the future version of library, it goes even a step further, right? Where we're changing the tile view considerably. We're introducing new visual treatments. We're rethinking the scrolling and pagination. And we're trying to improve the browsing experience by adding like filters and sorting, those kind of mechanisms to sort of help and ease that navigating experience. So why is design important, and why is it important when designing for products. I think this image really speaks for itself. And I think what we value very highly is simplicity. And we really try to put simplicity first whenever we're creating anything for people to use. We want to create something functional, something that's useful, and hopefully something that you can pick up and use without much explanation, if any, much training. And a lot of times we're aiming for something that we want to use ourselves. Obviously, people will need to come back to this thing and use it over and over and over again. So it needs to not be this, right? It needs to not be a frustrating experience. And then so by applying those different things, we can hopefully make something that's beautiful and nicely designed in the process. So a big challenge for us, and I think for all product designers in general, is that you have to design for everybody, including this amazing person here. I think it's really easy. We're guilty of this for sure, and I think a lot of people, when they build stuff, it's really easy to get wrapped up in your own bubble of sort of thinking, of feedback, and things you think are intuitive and well-designed aren't necessarily great for a wide audience. And so we always take this into account, and it informs a lot of our decisions. So ask yourself in the beginning and during your process, can anybody use this? And you pretty quickly start to remove things that aren't working and hone in on a solution that works the best. I think design and design thinking can also offer a very different way of approaching solving problems and finding those UX solutions. And we want to evangelize that process to you guys as developers to be open to design as a roadmap and make it part of your tool set as you build experiences and build things for VR. I think part of that, applying that roadmap, is creating and inventing those new ways of navigating, right? That's why I got into VR, because I wanted to make new stuff. I wanted to make this amazing, never thought of before way of navigating in VR. And it's something we all aspire to do. But really what we've found is it's about finding a balance between those new things and familiar things that are already there. So the nice thing about VR being this consumer product means that we have this really wonderful vocabulary of media and design patterns to pull from. And it allows us to not reinvent the wheel every time. And we often look to these things for inspiration. And a lot of times it's things and concepts outside of tech that inspire us the most. Things like sculpture, relationship between light and shadow, music, things that flow into the abstract are really valuable sources to pull from, and they shouldn't be dismissed. So keep those in mind. It's really, art truly does inform science and vice versa. And I'm sure you see that in tech all the time. So really, we want to make sure that we adhere to those tested methods, those things that have been learned, while still challenging their validity in VR. Do they really work as well in VR as they work elsewhere? And then finding new ways of expressing that intent through that medium, right? So we end up pulling these patterns from a lot of traditional stuff. And we do that because there's a lot of lessons there. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from those existing paradigms. And these behavior patterns are there, and they're tested and true, and because they've been refined over time through that feedback loop that I was talking about. And some of those are now expected by users and contribute to a good experience. And so ignoring them can lead to a poor one, right? So one example where we run into having to adjust these common patterns in other tech once they're in VR is text. And although some of these might seem sort of like rudimentary or basic, I think because we're always looking to products that people are already using, and through paradigms such as web and mobile, and trying to apply those in VR to a product, we're often having to adjust them in small ways, in nuanced ways. And it's important to consider those things when trying to reinvent or create that same experience in VR. So anyway, pulling a block of text, like it would be in a web page or a magazine or whatever, pulling it into VR ends up being this exceptionally wide thing that falls way outside of view. You need to turn your head to read, and it becomes sort of this uncomfortable experience. And really, it's about reducing that width, making it easier to read, reducing the amount of content that's being presented at one time. And this works really well in a vertical sense as well. If you pulled a page of stuff from, say, a web page and pulled it into VR, it would be this overwhelming, like my little guy there. It would be this overwhelming like wall of text, and it's just intimidating. Nobody likes to read vertically. It's just not a great experience. So shortening that text block and keeping that center focus solves that issue. I want to touch briefly on 2D versus 3D, and sort of, I know that's a big topic. It's exciting to think about 3D stuff. It really is. I know I do a lot. It's one of the main reasons why I got into VR. And we're still exploring a lot of that stuff. But it's also important to remember when you're trying to create a product for everybody that you never do 3D just for 3D's sake. A question we get really often is like, why isn't your interface this super awesome, VR UI where I wave my hands around like Tom? And although it looks really cool, most of the time it's a really frustrating experience. You just, in the end, especially in the early stages of product development, and while designing for multiple forms of input and keeping everybody, the audience, everyone in mind, it just isn't that applicable. Some of the things that happen, like layering a bunch of stuff in Z, can be really cluttered. And I'm not poo-pooing a 3D interface. I'm just saying that the reality of creating it is harder than one might think, right? So some of these basic principles in 2D still apply. And a lot of times it's the fastest, simplest way to build a functioning and pleasing UI. But having said that, many of those don't work as well. So my point is, it's about trying to find this balance between 2D and 3D and applying them correctly within the context of what you're trying to achieve. So always keep that in mind. One example of changing those conventions once in VR is this kind of standard UI layout. And it's not meant to be every single UI layout, but it's one we're all pretty familiar with, where a traditional sort of UI placing buttons in corners or at the top. Content is usually centered. You interact with menus on the edges to change stuff in the middle, et cetera, et cetera. Again, in VR, this is kind of a failed attempt, because you constantly need to turn your head to engage with those buttons and menus. You look at the left, something happens over to the right, you totally miss it. It's just not a great experience. And we see this a lot, actually. So solution is, again, kind of simple, but it works, again, really well. It's about narrowing that content width and then centering buttons and navigation. And that actually works really well for up high and down low. And easy access. Basically, yeah, it becomes a lot easier to use, is what I meant to say. So another great example of adjusting a common scenario to work better in VR is curving the UI. In a top-down scenario like this, we set up a UI in 3D space. And if it's flat, it's a comfortable distance when viewing the content directly in front of you. But as you start looking towards the edges, it becomes oblique, distant, harder to read, and it's actually further away, right? So simple again, by curving the UI, you end up with this entire space, and everything is the same distance, and everything is facing them directly at all times.
So all of that stuff took like months of just experimentation. And
Yeah,
figuring
wrapped
out.
up
It
in
was, like,
some slides.
Right. So like all of that stuff was really, it looks really simple, and in hindsight, we were very much like, oh yeah, it's really obvious, but it took a long time to come to the idea of, oh, we could curve the UI, this sort of stuff. So when we first got our hands on, say, the Gear VR prototype, and we wanted to make a store, we wanted to make a library, we wanted people to be able to interact with their content, buy content, own content, navigate through it, we got this headset and we're like, design something for it, make a thing. And we had no idea really how to approach this because VR is so different. We don't have the screen space, we don't have the frame, we don't have touch input or a mouse or anything like that. And we wanted to play VR to its strengths. So we had to sort of take it back to basics. So first and foremost, we needed to be thinking about the people who would be interacting with our product. We needed to be thinking about base principles of interaction design. So usability, how easy is it to actually use the interface? Utility, what are people trying to achieve when they're in VR? And that can also be finding the reason. We're not necessarily always giving them the reason. Satisfaction, how good does it feel to actually use the UI? Is there some sort of magic or nice feeling to it as you're using it? Communication, how well does the user interface communicate what you can do with it? And vice versa, how well can the user input back their intent into the UI? And finally, sociability. This is a new one that I don't think we'd thought about so much until recently, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So as designers, we need to take a different approach. We need to understand everything about the user's experience. We need to take this holistic approach. So thinking of the system as a whole, always designing with the user in mind first. We need to know every edge case. We need to consider every possible error, every scenario that could possibly happen. And we also need to break down the barrier between tech and design. We need to be building a product that works for everyone, not just experts, not just tech enthusiasts, not for a specific audience. So when you think about that, we have tech constraints that we're trying to improve, fix, things like aiming for 90 frames per second. But that's just the first step. So how can we take VR further? We need to explore the boundaries of the tech as designers to provide the best experience we can offer to people. Cross-pollination between these disciplines is how we can offer amazing results. So back to sociability. We need to find ways that enhance and humanize the experience of being in virtual reality. We need to be injecting social thinking into our products, as well as maybe our games as well. So one thing to think about is, as individuals, what does VR mean to me? When I'm standing in VR, when I'm using the experience. Another thing to think about is, what do people think of VR in general? And how, as designers and developers, can we influence that? We have the power to share worlds and share moments with our users and between our users. So we need to be thinking about how they feel when they're incorporated into those experiences. And on the flip side, what does it mean to others? How can we provide valuable and memorable moments for people in virtual reality? How can we make them feel welcomed? And not just that, but own the world that they're in. Another thing to think about is whether you're in VR with someone, or maybe you're in VR and there's someone outside sort of looking in. How can we have VR put its best foot forward to people who aren't actually using it, to non-users? And this is something that's really interesting. The audience is absolutely the way that we can push VR adoption. So when we make amazing products, when we make amazing games and experiences, word of mouth is the way that we can drive that. So designing moments that people can share by word of mouth. And finally, with design and with developing amazing games, we're strengthening our ties to VR and our audience's ties to VR, as well as each other when we're using this kind of social thinking. So when we were making these interfaces, it was really important for us to design things with this idea of the paradigm of a natural user interface. We needed to make sure that everything had a low learning curve, that the interface took its time to teach controls and interface paradigms. We needed to let them sit with it, take the time, and give them the space to get comfortable. And we absolutely needed to make it feel right while they were using it. And of course, this was something that was unusually important, was we needed this reassuring feedback. Motion cues and interface behavior that reinforces the user as they go through their journey through the interface. We needed to support people at every step along the way. So things like responsive buttons, confirmation animations, follow through, and overall visual design language. And this is something that we couldn't take from 2D paradigms, as Chris was talking about earlier. We needed to start building out this language. And this is a really exciting time because we all have the power to do this and find these paradigms. And to put it really simply, the UI is guiding the user from one part of their experience to the next, getting them to their goals. So this is a great way to think about it, just in a basic sense. So a good example of how we guide people through the user interface experience is motion flow. This is where, for example, we have a basic interface up here. We have a grid of content, and to the side, there are some buttons that you can use. Say, for example, they're categories, and you can switch pages by pressing those buttons. So if we're using raycasting, and say, tap on the touchpad or press A on the controller to select the button, you have to look to the left and then select. But you can't quite see all of the content to the side. We have an interesting challenge here where we have essentially a cursor, which is what the raycast is, but the cursor is tied to the user's view, and it's always at the center. So anything that's off to the side, too far, well, if it changes, you won't see it happening. So then we had to think about, well, how do we cue the user in? We did a lot of experimentation and came to this solution. So when they select the button, just using motion and direction, directing the user to the right. Of course, we can't take control of their angle of gaze, but we can imply a direction. So things like, and I'll just go back, the button extending out to the right, and maybe even the page reappearing from the left towards the right. This kind of stuff will guide their eye just using that directionality. Another example of this, making things easier and more communicative, is when the UI moves. So, another super basic setup. We have a button next to some content. And when you look at the button and select it, we want to introduce some new content. So when we press the button, we add some content, but the button is moved away. The reason for this might be we have a new page and the page is wider, something like that, or this expands out a new menu. The issue here, of course, is people won't actually follow that interaction. When they've pressed a button, they expect something to happen, but they don't expect to be selecting a new element in the UI. So in this case, this can be a little bit frustrating because now they're looking at something and selecting something that was unexpected. So very simple solution. If we move the content and not the button, again, super simple, then they're still maintaining their gaze on the button, and we've changed the page, we've changed the content that they're looking at. So something that's really interesting to us that was totally brand new is this idea of z-depths in design. So, of course, we all came from 2D design, and we have a really good idea of how to design for mobile and for web. But then once you get into VR, everything changes because now we have this sense of depth. So we were super excited just to just play in the simplest way with z-depths. So if we have two pieces of content in 3D space, Say there's a UI in the front and something far in the back. This could even be, say, the environment. If you're focusing on the front, you can't focus on what's in the back. And sometimes you'll actually have some sort of like clashing vision there. This happens whether you're focusing on what's close or what's far behind. So simple solution, bring those layers together. You can still have some z-depth there, and that can still look really, really cool. And this will work if the UI is close or far.
Thank you.
There you go. Yeah. Sorry, I pressed it twice.
Oh, that's all right. Thanks.
Yeah.
So one thing we come back to a lot, and it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, is this like emotional connection that our UIs eventually end up needing to have. And I want to address it separately from, say, the immersiveness of being in an environment, or what we usually consider to be that presence. Can the UI, through the actions of the UI and the experience that it's facilitating, can that elicit this emotional response? And in some ways, you can achieve it through unexpected behaviors, surprising, delighting the user in some way. Evoking that emotional connection is a huge part of that immersive, like not feeling like you're being pulled out of an environment because I'm now interacting with this thing that doesn't feel like it's part of that place. We want to remove those distractions and anything that's unnecessary that detracts from that immersion, and anything that will pull the user out of the experience that, or forgetting where they are. So one thing that happened was that a big thing that occurred really for us when we started thinking about the emotional sort of connection was obviously keeping comfort in mind. And locomotion caused by the UI is like the main thing that causes discomfort. And scrolling is a really great example of that. When we have lots of content, we initially thought, oh, we can just scroll through it. We know it, it works, everyone's familiar with it. And it was super uncomfortable. And additionally, it wasn't really that great of a way of parsing a lot of stuff. And so we had to rethink that idea. And what we found, so we're like, OK, let's take another look at it. So we slowed it down, and we found that this kind of scrolling by section, or just kind of chunking it, was a lot better. So we're like, OK, that's nice, but it's slow. What can we do to improve that? So we had this like, OK, this removes the locomotion part of it. But although it felt better, it didn't feel right. And although we found it reading from left to right was even easier than reading from top to bottom. So applying that to navigation actually works really well. Moving it in just very nuanced, simple ways, again, remove some of those large barriers that you would think needed some like crazy new way of exploring. Another issue with comfort is the idea of the UI and content being at the right distance. In a top-down scenario, if you place things too close, say within the range of 1 to 2 meters, things can be really hard to read, and it's pretty uncomfortable. We actually see this a lot, where people like to put things like right up in your face. And it's just really simple. Just move it out of the way. Move it further away from yourself, and it makes it a lot more comfortable to read. Lastly, one thing, keeping contrast of your elements in mind is really important. It might be a little difficult to see here, but you want to avoid this clash of whites, like really bright whites and really black blacks. Like especially on top of each other or next to each other. And so just bringing things tonally down alleviates a lot of sort of just strain. And you want to make sure that within your composition, you're thinking about those kind of things. So to reiterate, try to keep some of these things in mind when building UIs. Again, like Richard said, we really had to sort of take a step back and think about the discipline of what made a good experience versus just going full speed ahead and creating things. Think of how people are going to interact with your stuff. And I think considering each of these will give you a much better end result. And then I wanted to really just address this part of our process. A big part of that is you guys. We're very conscious of that we have a lot to learn still, and we're constantly learning. And it's really, really cool that this community shares so much knowledge with each other, and we want to share that stuff with you guys. And your passion for VR and making VR great is really, really important. So we're really excited to hear about how our stuff can be better, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how you guys integrate some of these concepts into your stuff as well. Some things to think about. Looking towards the future with new input models, better technology, faster, better, faster, better. When creating interfaces, I think there's some things that we want to apply to UIs, characteristics that we would like them to have. And some of these things they're maybe broad strokes, but they're things to think about and maybe apply as you move forward. So one of those is the UI feeling alive. And I hate the word organic, but the behavior being organic, right? And this is in the idea of the moving from one section to the next or adapting to changing content is done in this natural fashion, a fluid fashion. Again, going back to that emotional connection, how do you evoke that? And it's usually through the unexpected. Does it somehow transport me? Is it otherworldly, right? Is it achieving something beyond what I have normally attributed to the thing that's in front of me? Making it ordered, intuitive. I know it's a no-brainer, but we love structure, we love grids, but make sure it's not lacking purpose in some way. Make it easy to use. And then think about the context of the intent of the user, right? Do we have to show everything all at once? Or is there like an intent behind what I'm trying to achieve at that very moment? And how does the UI sort of respond to that intent? Does it do a certain amount of footwork or heavy lifting to support my intentions? And then again, make it personal. I love this idea, actually, of this like kind of sense of ownership. I want to carry it with me because, again, it pulls on that emotional driver for me. And it makes it mine. And so I can customize it in every way. And then think about multiple ways of digesting the same or accessing the same type of content. An easy example is like it's a search versus browse, right? Like a rich diegetic view versus a 2D meta view, right? It's really based on what I'm trying to achieve at that very moment. Am I in this discovery mode where I'm okay with taking my time and kind of flying through a bunch of things? Or is it a very specific thing that I'm after? and I want to just find it like right now. Those could be very different ways of navigating, and so maybe they're presented in very different ways. So in closing, I think designing for VR can be somewhat of a defeating experience sometimes. I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate. Trying a lot of new things. A lot of those things don't end up working out. But I really think as long as you're trying, as long as you're attempting and moving forward, it means you're on the right track and moving towards success. So I'm really looking forward to seeing all the rad things that you guys end up building. Thanks. So you guys, if you have any questions, go up to the mic up here on the right. And line up, I guess. Thanks for your time.
All right, guys, we got 20 minutes left. If you guys want to stick around and ask some questions and answers for Chris and Richard here, we got a microphone up in the top right, so we can go ahead and kick that off right now.
Hi, I'm Mac from Borrowed Light Studios. I was just wondering if you have any advice for dealing with UIs that may actually pass through geometry in your scene. So if you're pulling up a UI, how do you deal with that?
Man, that's a huge one. So definitely you don't want anything to be rendered in front of things that are actually far away. That's really obvious. So something that's really interesting that we tried out was, are you using Unity?
Yeah.
OK, so there's a really interesting effect with Unity projectors where you can create, have a texture projected out onto a surface, and it can go infinitely far. And if you set the projector angle and its properties to match the camera, then you'll have, say, some text that appears on the surface in front of you at the depth of that surface. And as you walk closer, it maintains its size, but is also at the same depth as that surface.
Okay.
So something that's really interesting to think about is how you can maintain the size of some content that you're projecting outwards onto the closest surface that it hits.
Right. So it's like the idea of the crosshair that's attached to the closest object
Exactly.
that it's colliding with.
Yeah. Not just attached, so you're recasting onto that object, but you're also scaling it accordingly so that they have a consistent size.
Have you ever considered maybe making the game view actually monoscopic for a time and just overlaying the UI separately on top of that? I wonder if something like that could work.
Making the game view monoscopic. That's...
So suddenly you're kind of condensing the entire vision into one plane, and then I don't know, maybe something to try, but.
That's interesting. I think a lot of the experiences that people would be interested in making really take advantage of stereoscopy. So if you compress it down into mono, then you lose a lot of the effect. And then there's the other question of how you make that transition in a comfortable way, because you're messing with IPD, you're messing with the angles of each of their eyes when you do that transition.
True. Okay.
So it might be really uncomfortable, but there might be a solution.
Cool.
We don't have all the answers. So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, what's up? I'm Brianna Wu. So when I think about the Oculus controller that's coming out, it feels to me like it's carrying a lot of legacy ideas from the game industry, or even a Mac, external controller. You kind of have a layer of indirection as you're using it, and I think that there's something with interface that's more natural. Like the iPhone caught on because there are no layers of indirection. We're tapping, we're touching. Do you have any faith in some of these, products I'm seeing come out that are kind of more, detecting gestures or things like that?
Yeah, I do. I think, again, in early stages of development, I think we're trying to reach the widest audience possible. And so it becomes sort of this not battle, but challenge to apply those ideas to things that people are already sort of familiar with and will attach themselves to.
Right.
So I think the like the iPhone, for example, I don't think the iPhone would have been as much of a success if they hadn't already been sort of used to what an iPod was, and that sort of understanding of what those. So it's like a conditioning effect almost.
Right.
And so I feel like we're sort of in the stages of trying to do that. That said, with motion and obviously the touch controllers, hands in space, I think once that is more of an understood premise, those types of interfaces will start to be a lot more prevalent. And I think we'll be applying those a lot more in our future versions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the biggest things we see when we do user testing, because we develop games for women, right? And if you assume the user understands paradigms like dual joysticks or things like that, you're losing a lot of your user base.
Right.
So when you're doing user testing with your particular paradigms you're working with, do you include women in your cohort? Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
It's tough finding women to play test this stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
At least it is for us.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
So something that's interesting about the touch controllers, though, is you get really rich interactions with just left hand, right hand, in
Right.
space tracked, and the triggers. And so you don't even really need to be pressing buttons for most things. And you don't have to have, say, press A to confirm, use the joystick to move, all of that stuff. There's plenty of experimentation that you can do, just say with, we have capacitive touch. So like giving a thumbs up or like making a fist as an input, like paradigm itself.
Right.
Then it becomes really kinesthetic instead of understanding all of the buttons on the face of the controller.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Evan. I did have a quick follow-up to the first question. I have heard of some people doing selective stereoscopy, dropping stereoscopy for specific user interface elements. I haven't done it myself, but I've been in a few talks where it's come up before. My question is related to the sort of idea of usable space. A lot of times it comes up that people are often surprised by how little usable area within the range of the center of the screen that people have, whether that's limited. And so my question is, as you've been working in UI and UX through several iterations of the hardware, have you found that as resolution's gotten greater, has that usable area grown, or is it more of a fixed, range of radians from that center? Just curious if you've noticed anything.
So, I mean, to a point, DK1 the resolution was so low that text had to be so large, and so for it to be even like barely readable, you had to have massive text. So by the point we got to DK2 and then on to the consumer version of Rift, the resolutions there are high enough that we don't have to like have really narrow blocks of text and lots and lots of scrolling and things like that. Something that's interesting to think about is if you think of, say, the users looking central, their cursor is ahead of them, there's kind of an area which is very readable, which is kind of not quite your peripheral vision, but closer in. Everything's readable, everything's very clear. Then there's another range outside of that, which is you'll notice motion, you'll have a generally good idea of like color and things like that around there. And then outside of that, you'll just kind of get glimpses of light or just motion and things like that. But that's because we have a little bit of lens distortion around the edges and things like that. So everything is kind of relative to just the visible area that they're looking through in the lenses. I don't know that we've seen any like massive like increase in like the usable radians or anything like that. But at the same time, I don't know how relevant that is because the users have so much freedom to move. That really only matters if you have something that's like face locked, for example. And then there's a whole host of interesting questions when we get to face locked UI. So,
Thank you very much.
yeah.
Hey Hey guys. I'm Tiffany. Hey.
Hello.
One of your slides said focus on being intuitive and creating intuitive experiences, which I think is obviously the key goal of VR. I was at a similar talk yesterday where Alchemy Labs, a fantastic contraption, were going through some of the cool things that they'd learned. Like, for example, when you pick up an object, the hand disappears, which sort of incidentally solves the one-to-one hand tracking problem when you're going through spaces you technically shouldn't go through. And that's something you would never know. You would only learn after, like, you know, I don't know, a solid month of beating your head against this problem. So I was wondering if you guys had any similar examples of problems that you have solved, or sort of clever hacks you found, or things you thought would not be intuitive but then were surprisingly workable.
I think one thing, the whole motion flow aspect of having to sort of guide the user's view, we're so used to just kind of like looking exactly where I'm supposed to be. Having to use motion in such a way really struck me as a thing that needed way more attention than I thought it was going to have to be. And you're like almost creating this like wayfinding sort of experience with how you're moving from one section to the next. For me, coming from like a animation background, having to apply that and then really be in a restrained manner was sort of like a really new experience for me. Do you have any specific stuff that you could think of?
So the question was like hacks that we weren't expecting to work that worked
Or I
surprisingly
guess
well.
maybe things that you thought would work that didn't work, but just sort of interesting like quirks of the VR interface versus other ones. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here too. So.
I mean, like the one example that like always comes to mind was this idea of we have menu on the left, content on the right, and you don't see the content change, or the button moves and the user doesn't track the button as it moves once they've selected it. So those are the kind of unexpected things as we're just figuring out people are using their heads and their necks to select things. I can't think of any hacks, but if I do, I'll get back to it.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, actually. Huh? What? Oh, yeah, like, one thing that's really interesting is just the size of the content that you put in front of people. So we had some like interface concepts where we were just like, we're just going to have a bunch of panels in front of you and they take up pretty much all of your field of view. This is the best way that we can show lots of content all at once, right? And so we were like, okay, let's make it scroll. And so swipe to scroll, and suddenly like we felt this intense like feeling in our stomachs, like we were like falling or rising. This is something that, like, if you're designing for a phone, ultimately, like to put it simply, the UI has a physiological effect on the user, and that's the first time that we've ever encountered this. Like, I think anyone's really encountered this.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you want to run like 100 miles an hour into VR and do all these amazing things, and then you end up like having to take a tiny little nugget of that and kind of move it from left to right and left to right until you have something that people want to use, basically.
So you mentioned curved UI, but currently in the SDK, you have the ability to use the layer compositor, but you can only put in quads.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any sort of push to kind of like move some of these ideas further into the PC SDK so that they're easier to use?
So we're not really talking about engineering, but so the layer compositor, we're not actually using that to curve the UI. And part of the reason for that is we're just building the geometry out in 3D space. The layer compositor is something that's really new, and I'm really interested to try it, but we haven't gotten around to that yet. So we'll see. I think it depends. If people find that they want to use it for UI and then they want to distort it, they want to apply it onto 3D geometry, then that's definitely something that we can investigate and get more integrated into the SDK.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
If there's a demand for it, I guess.
Hi. Any thoughts on local internationalization and localization to different languages, like Asian alphabets, right-to-left languages, voiceovers versus subtitles, stuff like that?
Yeah, we've done some experimentation with voice input. We've also localization is a big deal for us as well. We always consider that when creating any kind of UI bits and pieces. So that's a big part of user research, actually. So specific examples, I can't really cite, but yeah, we consider those very highly all along the way. I don't know much about changing the UI to adapt to other languages, other than just making sure that the design scales well enough.
Yeah, a lot of like when we're making concepts for the UI, we'll do it in English, and then come time to go into like production, then we'll be like, okay, let's put in German because German has many characters, and let's see how the UI can flex and change according to that. So a lot of that comes just a little bit later once we understand things from a usability standpoint and a functionality standpoint.
To add to that, so we have to design basically all of our user interfaces across our entire product line, whether it's home, Oculus Cinema, 360 photos, whatever it is that we're developing, to support just about every single language that's out there. I think we're in over 13 countries now, supporting 20 different languages. So everything that we build out has to adapt to support all those various use cases.
Hello, I'm Isaac, and I had a question about the conversation about 2D versus 3D interfaces. One thing that you said is that the curved interface was really cool because you could bring in designs from Photoshop and have the designers make the design and then bring it into this 3D environment. I was wondering, how much do you think that the creation of these 3D versus 2D UIs is going to change as the tools themselves change? Like as there's less iteration time from somebody being in Photoshop and actually being able to do your Photoshop in Unity, or actually be able to design in VR, is going to make 3D worlds more easy to comprehend and more easy to design for, versus being like do you think there's something inherent to 3D that maybe makes it more complicated, or do you think that it makes it more complicated in the design process because we don't have these tools?
Yeah, I think it's a tool set for sure. We're actually working like that kind of basic example of pulling those 2D comps into Unity is one of our first steps into creating tools that 2D designers that aren't necessarily, a lot of product designers aren't necessarily used to working in 3D environments, and they're not used to, some of them aren't used to coding stuff. And so to take advantage of sort of their understanding of what interactions mean, but also apply those to VR and not making a bunch of like designs in 2D and then having them all fall apart once they're in VR, is to build a proper set of tools for them to use so they're always in VR, so they're always designing in 3D, right? So that's actually a big passion of mine is to push towards having tools for designers, so we're always thinking about that process in the proper space rather than like doing this like throw it over the wall and then comes crashing back, you know, sort of thing. So we're hacking away at that process in very small ways, but again, I think it's the little battles that eventually will get us to the place we want to be.
Cool, thank you.
Sure. Right, I think that's it.
No other questions?
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.